Well, hey there, it's Rachel with Journey Back Quilts, and today we're going to be journeying back to the basics. We're going to be making half square triangles one at a time. Let's get started. To make these half square triangles, I have two different colored fabrics. I have some of this dark blue and a light blue, and we're going to be putting these together. So if your fabric has a right side to it with some pattern or some texture or something with that, you want to make sure to put those right sides together. And we're just going to match up those sides. And then we're going to be sewing down right down the center. Now my pieces are 4 inches because I want them to end being 3.5 with a little bit of wiggle room to be able to trim them up to that 3.5. Now I could probably get away with 3 3/4, but to be safe, especially if you're new at making half square triangles, just make them a little bit bigger, maybe 1/2 inch bigger. You don't want to waste too much fabric, but you want to make sure you have enough sewing room to be able to make mistakes. Now I'm going to mark a line from the diagonal points here, and I don't want to put my ruler right on that point and then on this point and mark, because then my line is going to be shifted just a touch away from that center line. So I want to get it off just a hair, just about big enough to put my marker right there in the corner, and we're going to draw a line all the way to the other corner. So see, I'm just a little bit off away from that point, okay? So we've got our little line there, and that is our seam line. So we're going to sew right on that line. Now, one half of this is going to be our half square triangle, but the other half is going to be just waste. And I hate wasting fabric, even though we're wasting just a little bit because we're going to trim these up. I'd rather do that than to make them too small and then have to waste a lot of fabric recutting everything and making them the right size again. But to save a little bit, we can make another little half square triangle on this side. So we want to leave ourselves about a half or a 1/4 inch away from our seam line, and then a 1/4 inch away from our seam line on the next one. So I'm going to put my ruler at the 1/2 inch mark on that line that we just drew, and then I'm going to draw another line on this side. So now I can sew down this side and this side. When we trim it down the center, we'll have 2 half square triangles. One that's a little bit smaller than we need, so we can save that for a different project. But this time, that way we are not wasting our fabric. And usually I just leave them folded in half like this with this seam sewn down, and then I just put them in my half square triangle bucket so I can make those for later. So let's go sew these down, and I'm going to show you how to put those together. Okay, so I have my open toe foot here. I use that just so that you can see where my needle is going and how everything is looking. So my fabric is stacked together with the right sides together if you have that. And we're just going to put the needle down in that corner. Okay, then lower your foot, and then we're going to sew right down this line. So here's another little trick before we sew this down, because my machine wanted to eat my fabric, and sometimes it does that when we're starting in a point. If you just take a piece of scrap fabric here, I just have the ends, my selvage ends, we can start sewing on that first just to get those thread tails up on top of our machine. Then we can start sewing this one. So I'm just going to leave that attached, and I have my needle down. Then I'm going to line up my line with my needle, making sure my fabric's still stacked nicely. Okay, and then we can start sewing to help pull that piece of fabric through. All right, you may notice that I have this tape here on my machine. That's called diagonal seam tape, and it is really, really handy. So the way you use it is you're going to line up this red line with your needle, and I usually have it all the way over my bobbin casing, but it started to peel up on me a little bit, so now I just have it here. I could take this off and redo it because you get a whole roll when you buy that that product. So you just line it up with your needle, and then you put your points So I'm going to do another one here. This one I have not marked, and so you can see how it works. Get my fabric all situated here. Okay, so I'm going to put the point of my fabric right up to my needle. See, I'm lifting my foot, and then I'm going to lower it, and then I'm going to line up this fabric with this point here on my diagonal seam tape. And then we can sew that down, keeping that point right on that center line all the way through. Now it would be a little bit harder to do our little mini block that we have on the other end. So I'm going to take these off, clip apart those connecting threads. I'm going to start with my leader fabric again. You can just reuse this thing over and over and over and just make it a big hairy mess of thread. And then we're going to sew down this one as well. So I'm going to line up that line and sew right down that line, and that will make my 2 half square triangles. So this one I just have 1, and this one I have 2. So here you can see I have 2 lines. This one I just have 1, and we're going to trim those, and I'll show you how it works. But another fun thing to do, if you have a lot of half square triangles to make, so I'm going to start with my leader fabric again, is chain piece these blocks. So chain piecing helps save thread, time, and eventually money, because you're not wasting a bunch of thread pulling those thread tails out every single time you finish a piece. So here we've got 1 piece, and I'm just going to sew right off that end. Keep my needle down, adjust a new block, get it all layered, and then lift my foot, put that point right up to the needle, and then line up my needle or my point with my tape here, since I don't have anything marked. Now you can go through and mark them all if you want to, and just sew all the way down. And then sew right off of that point, and then do another one. And you can just keep doing this until you run out of pieces to sew and you need to go back to the ironing board. So I'm going to sew these up real quick, and I'll see you back at the ironing board. Okay, I'm all done chain piecing. Now I'm going to clip apart those connecting threads, and I have this fun little cutting gizmo. We have some similar tools like this in our shop if you're interested. And I'm just going to clip apart those connecting threads. Super easy and handy. This was a game changer when I learned about this tool. Okay, now I like to set my seams, which just means we're going to iron them flat right down that seam. That just helps reset all those fibers back to where they should be after the sewing machine kind of scrunched them up. So we're just going to press all of these real quick. You can just layer them on top of each other and just give them a quick press. Okay, there we go. And now we need to trim all of our blocks a 1/4 inch away from our seam line. So here's the one that we sewed 2 little lines there, and I'm going to set my 1/4 inch line of my ruler right on that seam that we just sewed, and then we're going to trim a 1/4 inch away from that. So now we have 1/4 inch of fabric on either side of our seams, and now we have 2 half square triangles. They're not the same size though, so I'm going to put this one that we don't need right now in my scrap bin full of half square triangles so that I can make a different quilt later. And here we have the half square triangle that we need. Isn't that cute? So these ones that I didn't sew another line to, I'm going to go ahead and trim them. But if I keep the layers stacked together, then I can just sew a 1/4 inch away from my line here, and I'll have that perfect little half square triangle. So just leave those layers all stacked nicely if they'll stay. And then you can sew that 1/4 inch line down too. So that's another way to do it. So we're just going to go ahead and do all of these. And a lot of times I like to stack my blocks so I can get a few done at a time, as long as you have a rotary blade that is nice and sharp. You don't want to use a dull one because it won't cut through this and you'll be pressing even harder, which can hurt your wrist. And if you accidentally skip, you can really injure yourself. So make sure it's a nice new sharp one and you're giving nice even pressure going straight through. No pizza cuttering here, okay? So here's our little extras. I'm going to put those in my extra pile. And now I have 3 ready and cut. So let's do the rest of these real quick. And this block that I'm making, I need like, I think 60 half square triangles. So all of these video tutorials as we go through the next few weeks, we're going to be making a lot of half square triangles. But I'm going to show you lots of different methods on how to do them even faster than one at a time. The good thing about one at a time is if you're going through your stash of fabric and you just have a little piece of fabric and you want to put it together, you can still make these half square triangles one at a time. All right, so now we need to iron these babies. There are several different ways we can iron them. A lot of patterns say to press it towards the dark side. So I'm just going to put the light side of the fabric on my ironing board so that I can keep this seam flat. And as I peel this over, the seam is going to rest on the dark side. And then we're just going to put this iron down on the light side and butt it right up against that seam there and push it over. That way the seam is sitting on the dark side. And look how beautiful those are turning out. My points are just perfect. So another way to do it, a lot of patterns are saying this nowadays, is to open these seams. That reduces the bulk of the fabric behind the block so that when you do the quilting, you're not hitting bulky seams with your needle if you're going to do it on a domestic or on a long arm machine. It also helps keep the block the right dimensions because sometimes when you iron it over like that towards the dark side, just that little bit of bulk can help shrink your fabric just a little bit. Speaking of shrinking, I'm not using steam in my iron or spritzing these with starch or with water because I have not pre-washed or pre-starched my fabric. And if I did that, it may shrink those fibers just a little bit and then my block won't turn out the right dimension that I want it to be and my whole quilt block will be messed up. So we want to make sure we keep a dry iron. Now I've learned to use a really fun tool called a cobbler's clapper. It's just a piece of wood, a special kind of wood, and I am blanking on what kind of wood it is right now. But when you set it on your block, it helps absorb the heat from your block and helps set it nice and flat and crisp. And I love flat, crisp blocks. So this has been a very nice helper for all of these blocks. So we're just going to continue to iron these, and I think I'm just going to iron them towards the dark side. Now, ironing them towards the dark side can be helpful if you have to nest your seams at all. That way those seams can just nest together. I call it they're giving each other a little kiss. And what I mean by that is, well, let me show you with these two. So since there's a bump right here up to the dark side, if we were going to put the dark to the light and the dark to the light here, you could butt those seams right next to each other and they would just kind of lock in place. You can feel how smooth it is right here. If it's feeling bumpy at all, then just scoot it over just a little bit until those seams are right next to each other. And this is very helpful when making other types of blocks that we're going to get to later in this series. So we've got a few blocks here, and we're just going to continue to do that. So remember, light side down, peel that back, and let the iron bump against it to push it over to the dark side. And I like to do a few at a time like that and then put my clapper over both of them. Just kind of make things go a little faster when we can. It is amazing how that thing cools these blocks down so quickly. All right, last step to making our half square triangle blocks is we need to trim these up to the right dimensions. Now the quilt that I'm making, I'm going to make them at 3.5 inches. So let's measure them. I'm going to put the diagonal of my ruler on the diagonal of my block. And they're measuring about 4 inches, but I want them to be 3.5. So I'm going to take a little bit off each side. So I'm going to keep my diagonal on the diagonal of my block, hold that in place, and I'm going to trim these 2 sides, making sure that I still have 3.5 within my block here. So 3.5 is right here. So I've got another 1/2 inch to trim on the other side, which is perfect. So now we're going to just rotate this corner all the way around. Now these are our 2 clean sides. And I'm going to line up 3.5 on those 2 sides, making sure that the diagonal is still hitting right there on our block. And then we're going to trim these 2 sides. So remember, no pizza cutting, just one smooth, straight line. You might have to use a little bit of pressure. If you're using too much, you need a new blade or you need to sharpen your blade. Okay, so there is our 3.5 inch half square triangle. We're going to do that to the rest of them to get them all cleaned up and ready to go. And then these blocks will be ready for our quilt. Awesome job. I hope that you enjoyed this. Hey, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm so glad that you were here. I hope that this tutorial was helpful for you in making half square triangles one at a time with a little bit of a twist, getting one more snuck in there. That way we're not wasting any of that fabric, right? All right, well, if you would like more tips, tricks, and tutorials like this and cheat sheets on how to get your measurements correctly, I invite you to join me in my membership, which is Journey Back Quilts Society, and I would love to have you there. There you're going to learn even more tips, tricks, and tutorials, lessons on everything you can imagine. Next week, we're going to be learning how to do half square triangles 2 at a time. All right, I'll see you then.